Hey guys, welcome to episode 4 of the Tony Wong podcast. Today's title is Developing Remote Working Muscles is Critical, a Venture Capital Perspective. So for the past couple weeks, I've been thinking a lot about this pandemic, what it means for people, for us. And I've been thinking for people personally, like where we live, where to send my kid to school, given the possibility of remote education. Personally, my son Duquesne has done much better in remote working than in traditional on-site school. His grades are up, and so is his interest in education. And from a business perspective, I've been wondering about what the business climate would look like and how that will affect the daily lives of people working in tech. There are some signs that we'll gain some time and efficiency because the more remote work, the more time we'll save on the commute. But there will also be times that it will cause some additional stress in terms of Zoom burnout, reduced effectiveness of communication, and some of the challenges of building camaraderie and culture using a remote and distributed workforce. We talked about these topics and a few more on today's podcast, and I suspect this conversation will continue about the effects of the pandemic in upcoming episodes. Now on to today's guest. His name is Stephen Marcus. He's the co-founder and general partner of Riot VC, a hard tech venture capital firm here in Venice Beach, California. He is the founder of 6 hardware and software companies and an investor in dozens of others. He manages a pre-seed and seed portfolio of companies that have a combined enterprise value of $15 billion and has generated more than $600 million in 2018. He's here today to share his insights on how startups are dealing with the COVID-19 crisis and what issues they face. Please welcome Stephen Marcus. I'm not quite sure what you covered with Ron, but I think from the text I got from Ron, we wanted to talk about how venture capital is dealing with uncertainty through coronavirus, both from a personal as well as a professional perspective, as well as guidance you're giving to your startups. Ron, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think also, Steve, what you're hearing maybe from other VCs, there's different, it seems like this economy is split between like clear winners and a whole bunch of struggling people and businesses or whatever. And so curious what the VC community is seeing across their startups. Things you've heard on the ground and how they're advising and triaging. And this, I think this could be an interesting topic for people to listen to.
Yeah, sure. Lots to unpack there. Why don't I just give you a little bit of background on me and then, to know where I'm coming from on this stuff, and then give you the real time, what we're seeing today. I've been an entrepreneur for 20 years and selectively, I've been an angel investor, VC, for a few years in between my entrepreneurial track record. And if I rewind the tape, I've been through 3 of these. This is my 3rd one. We had the 2001 bubble burst, hit the economy pretty hard. 2008, 2009. And in both instances, I was investing and, operating companies and working on deals. And so I can tell you, back in the 2000 timeframe, we had the dot-com bubble. In 2000, I had a big personal exit. September 11th, 2000, I had one of a big personal exit. I sold a bunch of wireless spectrum. I owned about 20% of it between New York City and Boston, sold it to Nextel. And literally the following year, September 11th, 2001, obviously we had the Trade Center attacks. And 2 weeks after that, I was in an FCC spectrum auction. And very few people actually showed up to that auction. And I bought millions of dollars worth of wireless spectrum licenses that I ended up selling much later. I actually bought a really premium set of spectrum because nobody showed up. And later on, I sold pieces of it, for multiples of what I paid for it. And a lot of people showed up at a future auction for the remnants that actually fetched even more money. And what happened in 2000, 2001 is a lot of people, the startups that had a lot of sort of flimsy revenue ambitions and didn't have really sustainable businesses, didn't get funded. A lot of people went back to grassroots and stuck to companies that were real businesses, and it took a while for it to recover. And the cycle built up again in 2007, 2008. You started to see, companies that were kind of questionable get funded. In 2008, 2009 came around. I was at a venture fund part-time. I had just graduated from business school. I went to business school at MIT Sloan and graduated. And I was working on a take private. I was trying to buy a public company, a public paging company. And I had raised $250 million. Literally the day that Lehman went under, I had a private equity sponsor actually on the phone talking about backing the idea that I had to take a company private. And that company had great cash flow, had a really low market cap because it's the capital markets, the public markets had really tanked. And, it was a high cash flow business. And so private equity really liked that idea of high cash flow, steady business. You could put it into a new opportunity. And I found sympathetic ears there. So we were able to raise $250 million and got pretty close to buying it in 2009. 2009 ticked over and, couldn't agree on the price with the company, but got pretty far. But I remember it was blood on the streets. 2008, 2009, I was part-time in a venture fund, part-time working on this take private. And in the venture fund, we worried about LPs not making their capital calls. I mean, literally, we were wondering, if we asked for capital, would we even get it? We would run around to every one of our companies and said, hey, what's your cash position? How much time do you have left? Can you cut your burn to make it through the turbulence, the short-term turbulence? But the consensus was that we were long-term capital. At the end of the day, we don't invest for 6 months. We invest for 10 years. And we just had to survive the dip, if you will. Fast forward to today, that same playbook has taken shape, where you triage your portfolio and you want to see who's got enough cash to make it through the turbulence. Because right now, what happened in March is investors just pulled back, just said, you know what, let's just see where the dust settles, because you don't know how the markets are going to be affected. You don't know what's going to be a good place to be, a bad place to be, where the revenue is going to be. You don't know. So deal volume in March just went to zero. I mean, just people just weren't making investments. But in venture, specifically in venture capital, we're investing for 10 years. So if you don't invest you wait until the coast is clear, you have a big hole in your returns. And honestly, the investments that I made, the angel investments that I made in 2000, both out of the venture fund and an angel investment, I invested in a company called Okta that's now a $20 billion market cap company in 2009. It was nuclear winter. Best time to start a company. The returns are fantastic from that vintage year of investments. I also invested in a company called meld.Operandi, which was in the luxury fashion pre-tail space. Literally high-end, that multi-$1,000 purchases. And in 2009, it was, are people going to spend any money on luxury? The reality is that a lot of people were in that. People who've got money to spend on a couple $1,000 pair of shoes typically still have that money, even through this kind of environment. So there are businesses that tend to do well, but the paradigm is hard to get your head around. But I think that today that still holds true. I think that people are still investing. I think seed tends to be the better place to be because it takes some time to get revenue. Nobody's going to fault you for not missing, having a few quarters of no customers. It gives you time to work on product. Your teams tend to be small. Talent's abundant. I mean, lots of people are out there. Costs of every piece of your business have now come down. Commercial real estate, talent, supply, everything you might need is much cheaper than it was before. So, I mean, that's a lot to unpack there, but I just threw a bunch of stuff at you.
Yeah, so that's super interesting. The parallels between the previous crashes and today. There's a lot to unpack there, but I'm thinking we're all going through a lot of change in this, and there are several levels of impact. Maybe we start with, I guess you started from a venture investing perspective, but what about from like a inside a startup perspective? Like, what are the leaders facing there? What are they having to deal with in terms of staff and the thought about going back to work?
Yeah, well, so we're, Riot Ventures, we're deep tech investors. And so it's many of our portfolio companies have some sort of physical component, that they have machinery or equipment that people need to interact with. So there's that group of people that have needs to be present. And then there's a group of companies that can work remotely, probably already are working remotely, software focused companies that have the ability to just work from a laptop from wherever they might be. And I think that companies that have flexibility to work remotely some of them have realized no disruption whatsoever. They just continue doing what they're doing. The companies that have some sort of need to be present in a physical, need to be in the physical realm have had to deal with some changes, just spacing out, limited numbers of people in the office, just changing SOP for how you interact with one another because you have to. But I think that we've already had an acceleration of people to do remote work. I mean, distributed teams were so much part of the startup world. I mean, even today, you fund a company, the 20 employees they might have, 10 have already been distributed. Just getting developers from across the world or talent to work for wherever they are. Just we've become that anyway. But
Right.
This has certainly put more pressure on you operationally. Having been a CEO, the hardest thing to do is to build culture and operational efficiency when everybody's remote. And so you tend to need to develop some muscles, if you haven't already, to do those things. I think you have to be a better manager in order to do those things well.
And do you see that trend continuing, going to remote work?
For sure. I think that people, there's partly even a liability question here, is if you ask people to come back to work and be in an environment where they could get some sort of disease, and you ask them to do that, I think companies have concerns. And I think in the near term, in the next year, companies will even elect to do it, to have remote work, even if that's not the sustained state, that they will do that for a while. I do think that people will tend to favor remote work, but I think it's hard. It's hard on employees too. If you're not used to remote work, how do you set up your environment at your home or wherever you want to work to be effective? And that some people might never be effective from home. So it's two sides. I think the reality is it's going to be with us for a long time.
And so when you talk about changing or making adjustments to the culture and developing those muscles for remote work, can you talk more about, from the company perspective, what that looks like? Is that changes in process or changes in methodology, as well as maybe dig into, on the individual side, what do you mean by changing their setup at work to facilitate remote work?
Look, even now when we're interacting, Ron and I have had this discussion too, is that nothing beats the high bandwidth communications you have face to face. 70% of communications is nonverbal. It just is. And you can communicate and be much more effective sometimes with a very short 5-minute interaction that might have taken you an hour or 30 minutes some other way. So I think if you're used to that high bandwidth communications, meetings, occasional water cooler get-togethers, whatever it is, short spurts, you'll have to find a way to be effective. If your brainstorming is get in a room, have an exchange between people, the creative process can be very stunted without some sort of effective exchange of ideas and communications. So I think that it depends on the kind of job. The creative communications, you have to find some way to have a dialogue, have breakouts, be able to have ideation and work through it. You also need to have all of the tools to do whiteboards, to update people on progress, to share the work that they have completed. It's much harder in the physical realm. Obviously, it's almost impossible. But for the software world, or for people that are working on independently but occasionally collaborate on something, you're just going to have to make adjustments and develop new processes. I think that culturally, what I've seen people do is you find opportunities to celebrate and to relax and socialize some other way. So you're using distributed mediums to find some way to let your hair down and be expressive without it just being a formal, let's get together for a meeting. You let people build culture that way. And I think what might happen in the future is that even if you have a distributed state, that you find some way to get together periodically, physically, to exchange. I mean, there are companies who have formed over the last 10 years that have been completely remote from the get-go. And they find ways to get together and, spread their culture. But you need to do that. Otherwise, it just ends up, you can't effectively build culture. Let's think about that.
Yeah, I'm sure we've all heard that Twitter this past week went remote permanently. And then a few banks on Wall Street were talking about that this week. JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, and one other big bank. And there was a New York Times article talking about those three banks occupy around 10 million square feet of office space. And they expect some of their workers to never go back to being on site. So I think that's going to have a not only a lasting impact across tech, but across the general economy. So people are going to have to adjust. And so,
absolutely.
Yeah, tell me, so you've been working from home probably for the past couple months at least. What adjustments have you had to make?
Look, I've always been I work whenever, wherever I can. And so that, I am to a fault switched on all the time. And I've found ways that work for me. I think at home, having your children around, like my kids are home right now. My wife is home right now. I'm having to do this podcast in a separate room. Just finding time where you can be separate, that you can do your work without interruption. But also, I'm extrovert. I feed off other people. I like being around other people, and I like to see other people doing work. So I need to find ways to get motivated. I need to have conversations with my coworkers, with other people. That's what gets me moving. But I've always had to do this. My wife is spectacular at it. She's an investment banker. I'm so impressed with her work ethic. I think a lot of people have a hard time with this, is that she can be 100% on at any moment, just laser focused on the task at hand and get in the mode. I think a lot of people, like Jeff Bezos, says that he only makes his decisions between a 2-hour window in the morning, after he's had his breakfast and his, morning coffee. He has, I think it's like 8 to 10 or 9 to 11 is when he makes all the critical decisions. Some people need time to ramp. And for me, I need time to get going in the morning. Like I can't wake up at 7 a.m. and be on. I need an hour to just gather myself. And that's much harder at home because you just can't, it doesn't feel like work. I remember 10 years ago, no, it's even longer than that. In the early 2000s, when telecommuting was the topic, they had a reporter had done a piece on a guy who worked from home. He woke up, took a shower, he put on a suit, brushed his hair, everything, and then he just walked into the living room and sat in front of his computer and did work. And the lady's like, well, why did you put your suit on? And he's like, well, look, I needed to get in the frame of mind of work Otherwise, I just can't do it. And I think that's the worry about telecommuting or like remote work is, can you be efficient? Can you find a way to be self-motivating? Can you be efficient in the environment in which you're in? That's hard.
So what are you suggesting to your portfolio companies that they do to make sure that their staff are efficient?
I mean, I think that so I'm careful, every environment is a bit different. And so I'm careful to think about the differences between them. I think what we've spent the most time on with portfolio companies is about hiring. How do you hire new workers having never met them physically? How do you get a feel for who they are? How do you develop process to get them to be come up the learning curve and be efficient? That's hard. That's hard. How do you get them to blend into the team? I think that people have different levels of comfort too. I remember when we had a portfolio company who was trying to hire, at the beginning of the crisis, and it was a question of, do we want them to come in? Do you need to have them physically present in order to do it? And are they comfortable? Is everybody on the team comfortable meeting somebody with coronavirus out in the ether?
Right.
So
yeah,
we spent time on that. I mean, I think a lot of people, we've had questions from portfolio companies about when you have a reduction in force, how do you manage the mental crisis that goes on there? Like, what do people think? How do you deal with all the stress and the bad news cycle that comes through? That's been hard.
What's an example from that? Like, how have companies been dealing with that?
I think that the answer to a lot of this stuff is communications. Constant communication, speaking to your employees, letting them know the state of play, the why, that what's, a bit more into what your plans are for the future, instead of just taking the action and then letting people come up with their own conclusions as to why.
Yeah, Ron and I were just talking about in a previous podcast about communications, especially over digital means. And like you were saying earlier, 70% of communication is nonverbal or something other than you get over, 2D mediums.
Yeah.
And so, if you do focus on communications, is it just more? Is it communicating more, or do you have to employ some other means that you're not used to employing to be able to communicate over, video?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to use every available medium. People are different kinds of learners. Like some people are kinesthetic, some people are oral,
right.
People are visual. And I think you have to give people a plethora of mediums with which they absorb information.
Right.
People like to see their leaders lead, and video and the projection of confidence and a message means a lot. I think that writing it down, everybody likes if it's written down, it's serious rather than just hand waving and communications. I think you have to use, whatever you can in order to get the message across. And people like communications. Like the more visible you are as a leader, I think the better. And concise and to the point, where everybody comes across, you're not just a deluge of information. It's about concise leadership. It's about the messaging that people understand. They should feel comfortable with you as the leader taking them to the promised land. You don't have all the answers. You're not supposed to have all the answers. It can't be this is exactly what's going to happen. It's just going to be, this is my plan. Let's do it together. And we will figure it out.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can think of like a great example of someone recently, either in a portfolio company or not, who really embodies that sort of communication that you're talking about, just so listeners can get like a more visceral understanding of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, we have several portfolio companies that sort of did this. Want to name names, but went through this plan of action where they did an assessment of everything that they were doing and asked themselves, is this important? And what should be the next steps that we take? Assess their cash position and hiring needs and staffing levels, and looked at it really quickly, came up with an analysis of their business and said, if we don't have X for a period of time, what do we do? And you rip the Band-aid off quickly. So I think for the companies that needed to do a reduction in force, they did it fast. They did it deep. So you only do it once. And you communicate that plan, like architected a beautiful deck, communicated with people over Zoom and over email about what's happening and the why and where they were going. And we had several companies do it. We had, we're fortunate that we only had really one company that out of our portfolio that, was in the red zone, we'll call it. Most of our peers are dealing with a lot more portfolio triage, but our portfolio actually has a pretty good amount of runway and prospects. And some companies even have a tailwind in this. So
yeah,
I think it's just been decisive leadership and communications, and people did that immediately. I mean, I don't care if you were in a great position or not. Every company had to sit there and say, take stock of what they have and communicate that to employees. And so every one of our portfolio companies did that.
Interesting. Ron, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, look, I think, as we started moving through the crisis, a lot of different thoughts went through our heads. One was, do we need to be one of those startups that make some quick decisions on headcount cuts? And our gut told us we weren't, but we still needed to go through the exercise and just and kind of work through different scenarios to see if we're making good decisions here, because you're super reluctant, especially if you're a fairly new startup like we are. The thought of making cuts is a jarring thing, and when you start diving into it, it really makes you check all of your other assumptions really well. And we landed on, because of our particular situation, that we didn't need to do that. And though we weren't sure, we were taking some extra risk and stress thinking through it. And then, 3 or 4 weeks in, a couple other key business things continued to develop for us. And it looks like it was the right decision so far. It's a hard crisis to predict, though. And there's no one living, or there's very, very few people living. There may be a couple of Spanish flu survivors, but I think they were probably infants. So I don't know if they remember that particular crisis. But I think, and there's very few even World War II survivors out there right now. And so this thing is going to be super hard to predict. And it does, it keeps me up at night sometimes. I've got to really shut it down. I've gotten better at it, as the crisis is extended. But there's been, several sleepless nights in the last 8 weeks, maybe even 10 weeks, thinking through, what the impact of this thing is. And you're still worried as an executive in a startup that some other shoe may drop. There's this weird issue in the stock market right now where retail investors and institutional investors mostly seem to think that this isn't going to have a giant economic long-term impact. There's a ton of signals, real world signals, that this is going to have a very long-term economic impact. And you worry at any day if somehow those two things are going to collide and reality is going to set in on the downside. And if it does, does that tip us into a true Great Depression level event? I mean, we're seeing that in unemployment right now, right? And then, is the political system and the central banking system going to take the let's fight through it and do more stimulus? Now, there's already been a ton, or let's just switch to austerity mode and fight it out. And and we know there's politicians and bankers that lean towards that more austerity kind of approach. And if they pull that trigger, what does that do even for healthy startups or or even for very healthy businesses. I mean, hell, no one thought Airbnb would be laying off a huge chunk of staff. It's, that should be a wake up call to everybody, no matter how good your business is. So like, I think there's been a lot of stress over it. I think we're all kind of hunkered down, trying to be conservative with spend, trying to figure out how to do this remote work thing. We were actually just talking earlier this week. We need to do probably a resync and really put some more effort into more effective remote work practice. We thought this was going to be like a 2-month, 3-month initial push maybe. And so we kind of just sent everybody home and did some light work on efficient remote practices. It does look like, for sure this is going to be a much more extended thing, and we may not get back in the office at large scales of people for a while. And so we probably need to spend some leadership energy on doubling down on remote best practices and starting to shift the culture more that way. Our business isn't super remote friendly. It can work, but both because of the speed we're working at and the type of work we do, we'd rather have everybody back in the office. And so that is going to be somewhat of a challenge for us. And there's probably a leadership offsite coming, or now virtual offsite of maybe even next week or the week after, so that we can spend more time on that topic.
Yeah, what are those things that you're thinking about? Are those systematic changes to how you manage and lead teams? Like, is it more of a switch to a decentralized, distributed decision-making paradigm versus a more hierarchical structure?
We're small enough now where I think hierarchy still kind of works, and we have founders that have very strong technical capabilities and vision, and so they're integral to the product development cycle, and so is kind of the core leadership team right now at our stage. But yeah, I think it's more like, how do you coach people to better manage their work hours versus family hours or whatever? How do you aggregate work getting done statuses into something everybody can consume? How do you improve visibility and the general transparency of key things getting done? And then how do you drive the alignment of what everybody needs to be working on? Again, like for the last 8 or 10 weeks, yeah, let's all jump on a call. Here's our priorities. But, even now I think you can see where maybe stand-ups, a few people show up a minute or two late now. And, we're in the office, you would see them sitting in a chair and could grab them. Now it takes a little more time to sync. And so people are kind of, as this thing drags on, personal life and work life are we're already mixing. And now it's, I think everything's melded together. And so how do you coach people and get them tooling and processes to support better defined lines? And I think that involves, like, we haven't, and no one's asked, but we haven't subsidized work offices yet, but that may be a thing we're going to need to do. And mostly just to let people start creating some kind of line that, hey, when I'm in this chair, I'm working, wherever it is in their house. So I think those are some of them. And then I think we also have to do a generally better job of, probably tooling and some process of tracking work better and making sure that effort's being spent on the right priorities. It's not terrible for us. We're doing fine, but I think there's efficiency is going to continue to bleed off if we don't really figure out a more long-term sustainable approach for this. And then the last piece of it really, and I know it's for me personally, and I think it's for everybody in this, there is a grind to this, if you're not used to working remote, I think in particular, and because of the constant blending of personal life and work life, and maybe for a typical enterprise job, that's really normally a 20-hour-a-week job, but you're in the office maybe 35 hours a week. For a startup, being always on and it constantly blended with your personal life, it is creating I think a mental tax where, maybe we need to go to every other Friday off. So people have a 3-day weekend a couple times a month. Again, creating more white space so that there's a clear line that work has ended and you need to take some time for yourself and your family or whatever. We've seen some of our own customers start that, and some of the bigger game companies, I think for the same reasons. And so we'll see. Those are all things we've got to work out.
Stephen, something there looked like it resonated with you. What was that?
I've been a CEO for a long time, and I love developing people. And I think the hardest thing that you have to do over this stuff is how to be a good coach and mentor as well. That's really, it's one thing to be efficient. I spent hours with people that have gone on to great things. And it's just amazing when you can sit down with somebody and you let something happen where you're just communicating with them, giving them feedback, listening, just time to, shoot the proverbial SHIT, right? It's just to be with somebody. And so finding time to do that, borders blend, some people are going to work even more and find this to be a much more successful environment. They're not going to get derailed. There's a lot of managers who like the management by walking around and not going to be disrupted. I know plenty of CEOs who love to just take somebody away from whatever they were doing and disrupt them constantly. They're like, just love to screw them up. And without that, some people are going to be hyper efficient. And then some people are going to really go down the tubes, that they're really just going to be unsuccessful at home. And as Ron said, I agree with it wholeheartedly. You have to find some way to measure everything, to have some sort of way to keep people on the tracks. And that's hard. That's a really hard discipline. It's just hard to do. And it's like building a race car with remote people. Like, how do you get everybody to know what piece they're doing, how much they torque the wrench? It's like flying blind.
Yeah. Yeah. So it definitely sounds like the work from home is emerging as one of the biggest topics of, working through ambiguity. And it doesn't sound like we have any definitive answers.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I think the other interesting thing me and my wife have been grappling with this weekend, there's a lot of news that kids are actually more impacted by this than people were thinking. And there's even a new study this morning that kids are actively spreading this, which seems common sense. But there was a period for the last couple of months where some of the science was saying maybe kids weren't spreading it that much. But I think written by people who've never hung around young kids eating lunch before. But but like, to me, it's like, I don't see, maybe in some of the more insane states, school's going to start back up, but I don't see any rational parent willingly sending their kid to school if they have some other option. And there is, again, there's going to be this economic divide issue and other things where, school serves a very, very important function of daycare, and not everybody has a stay-at-home parent or a caregiver where that can easily replace that. And so it'll have a huge economic impact if schools don't reopen. So the pressure to open them is going to be huge. But, we don't see ourselves sending our kids back to school until there's a reliable vaccine. And for all kinds of, plus we're older parents anyway. So, I'm 50 now, and I'm getting closer to that much higher death rate of this thing. And so I don't want my kids to bring it back to me. Right. So even if it was relatively harmless to kids, it could be, incredibly harmful to me or the wife or the kid's grandparents or whatever, or our neighbors. We live in a neighborhood with a lot of even more senior people. And so like, there's this, like, we literally had the conversation this morning about, hey, if we're going to be working from home for a while, why aren't we just doing this in Hawaii? And not because Hawaii is just a beautiful place, right? But Hawaii is the only state that has implemented any kind of sufficient quarantine to protect the islands from all the other people who aren't taking this thing seriously, and all the other countries and states, even across the U.S. And so, I don't see California shutting its borders down and mandating 14-day quarantines for people from Georgia, right, or whatever. And I don't even know if the Constitution would allow it. And it's going to be, it's going to be interesting to see this blue state versus kind of red state split that seems to be forming around how to treat the virus. And it's going to put incredible pressure even on the blue state governors, though, not everybody in a blue state's blue. And so to open up anyways, because all these other states are. And so Hawaii, if you want to stay in an American territory, Hawaii seems to be the only one that's going to be able to pull it off. Maybe Alaska could, but Alaska, I think, politically is going to lean more towards opening up, and it's probably been mostly untouched by this thing so far, anyways. And so there's this. So now, like, if you think about something like that, that started going through my head. I'm like, that could be pretty easy for us. We're fortunate enough we could probably do that. I'm already living, in a more remote area of Utah right now, where I was commuting to Los Angeles. And so the lifestyle change won't be that big of a hit. But then I was like, well, damn, it's there's like a 3-hour time zone difference. That means I have to get up at 5 a.m. for an 8 a.m. California call, and a 9 a.m. Eastern time call would be even way worse. And so maybe that's not doable after all, right? And so, like, these are some of the, and I don't think I'm alone. Like, these are, I think, questions a lot of people who have some options are going through right now. And I bet there's even startups that are considering, like, moving to a green zone country or a more green zone state. If you have to have people working together, how do you bring them together without being in some kind of known safe place? But I think that's another piece of this that is yet to play out.
Let me add to that. I actually, I think there were a bunch of trends already. California already had, these high-priced cities were making it untenable for people to live in anyway. And a lot of talent, you're pulling from different places, and a lot of talent's finding it, they need to be somewhere else just economically anyway. But I think this is all just part of the same cycle. I think coronavirus just ends up doing the same things. As we get older, we tend to move out of cities and move more rural anyway. And so that's the natural progression. I think young people, for everybody that leaves, in New York City, there's a 20-something-year-old ready to move in and live the New York dream. And, real estate prices will go in this cycle, and they already were, depressed before coronavirus. They'll make it so that those people can get in there and they have roommates and whatever they need to do in order to live there. But I think it's just accelerating what's already the normal cycle. California, live in California, recent transplant to California. I think California is a very tough state for new business formation, and has become that way. It's really, I would call it more anti-business than other places that I've seen, which is amazing because it's got so many successful companies in it. But I think it will accelerate a lot of what's already been happening in California, where people are moving out of San Francisco. LA is very expensive, but it's cheaper than San Francisco. Some people will move out, but new people will come back in. But other states, there are, Ron, I think Ron's right on it. There are blue states that are going to open up faster. It's prisoner's dilemma. As soon as one state opens up, they tend to all need to open up and together. Otherwise, you have a huge economic disadvantage because, if California stays closed 2 months longer than, let's say, Texas, new business formation is just going to move there, or people are just going to move there in general, just because, as you said, the kids, the taxes, the economic opportunity are going to be greater. Why stay in California? I think that California is going to be forced to make a decision to open up, or the states that are closed are going to be forced to make a decision more quickly to open, because they just need to compete with other states. So I think it's going to go that way. But I think all these trends are the same thing. And the 20-somethings they feel invincible, and they're not as affected by coronavirus, and they are the fuel a lot of times in these startups. So I think it's, they're just willing to go to work. People with I think people at a huge disadvantage who have other underlying medical conditions. You have asthma or you have something else, you're at a huge disadvantage in the marketplace.
Yeah, I feel like this business was high pressure before coronavirus. I mean, this business was the disruptor, right? It was leading change, and it was leading the fast-paced lifestyle. That was before coronavirus. And now we're looking at prolonged disruption. Like just with coronavirus, we're looking at waves of virus threat, right? And so Ron was just talking about, the kind of mental tax, the emotional impact of all this. And now we're looking at this being the new prolonged norm. And I'm wondering, what that's going to do to people. I mean, the people on this call seem to be faring pretty well, but for how long? And what about everyone else?
Look, to a fault, I'm an optimist in this situation. I think that you rewind the tape to 2008, 2009, we had a pretty bad economic downturn. And if you look at the data, there were a lot of new business formations. There were a lot of business closures. It was about equal. Shockingly, there were, it's like 400,000 closures and 480,000 openings in 2009. It's roughly the same. I think we tend to feel like it's going to be pretty bad, but I think we regress to the mean quite quickly. And I think a lot more people in the U.S. have already been infected by the coronavirus. I think it's less deadly than a lot of models predict. And I think that doctors and the media have made it feel worse to us, more apocalyptic. An epidemiologist or an MD, every time I see a doctor, they have their good ability to scare you. And, every time I go see a doctor, it's like, I feel like I need to make some drastic changes to my life. And I think that the media tend to focus on some data that aren't great, just about the new number of new infections. I'm watching carefully a lot of stuff that goes on in the world, how Sweden's doing, how that parallels to what we could do. I'm an optimist. I think that in a year, this will be well behind us. I don't think a vaccine is realistic. I actually don't think it's going to happen. And, it may never happen. We have bubonic plague still in the world. I mean, it's amazing to me. And parts of Madagascar that you can get bubonic plague. There's
Denver.
In Denver. So it takes 4 or 5 years. It might take forever to get a vaccine. I think the only realistic outcome here is that we get a critical mass of people to get it that are, not as affected by it. And then hopefully it dissipates. We don't know what's going to happen. But I do think people are going to venture out. We're going to be back in business doing things faster than people want to admit. But it's a political crisis right now. I think it's very political. No one wants to be the first one to open. You certainly didn't want to be the last one to close. And it's just a hot potato. And I understand why politicians don't want to pull the trigger. It's really, really hard.
Yeah. It's definitely it's definitely very politically driven. And it plays into the worst parts of politics, right? Because there's no reward if you guess right in this, and the downside is huge if you guess wrong, and it's and politicians hate those kind of conundrums, and they will tend to move slow to whatever the right decision is. I agree. I think. Obviously herd immunity one way or the other is the only way out of these things. So, this herd immunity topic is certainly interesting because however long it takes us to get there by whatever method, Silicon Valley has already had this underlying current of fund young entrepreneurs, seek out young workers, in large part because of the way the work hours are structured do tend to benefit people without families and the young, and however fair that is. It seems like herd immunity is going to be another piece of this, and maybe even a darker side of it. The other part that's going on in Silicon Valley, we had a previous podcast where we were talking about nootropics and augmenting performance with performance enhancing drugs and things like that. Is herd immunity going to be seen by the young in Silicon Valley as another performance enhancing drug, right? And and then how do we ensure that things are still reasonably fair and we don't incent bad behavior in the tech community for people who won't be able to return to work maybe for a while, like maybe for years? Like there could be immunocompromised individuals that will not maybe be able to safely re-enter the economy for 3 or 4 years, especially if your thoughts on the vaccine hold true.
It could be Gattaca, at the end of the day, where we have, instead of, the color of your skin, it becomes the content of your DNA and your antibodies, very easily disguised as a drug test or something along those lines. It just becomes genoism. That is a huge risk. Already Silicon Valley is ageist. It has been. If you're trying to get into the business and you just start in your 40s or 50s, there's no chance. It's just it's so difficult that you have to have a track record by that point. But it just is that way, exactly as you play out. And now this just accentuates it even more. You have to take an antibody test or take some sort of PCR test in order to go into the office, and that's discrimination just by another name.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be interesting, and another political problem to solve too. Like it's not going to be that's not going to be simply solved. That layer of worker protection or whatever.
Yeah. It's going to be hard. I do think that it's going to be, I think we're going to come out of it faster than people think. I think it's going to disrupt a lot of businesses. There are going to be a lot of destruction of business, but where there's always, where there's just business destruction, there's somebody who starts something new to solve the demand in the market. So I think for all the businesses that might die, there'll be new ones to take their place. I think the big companies are going to get stronger, and that's going to change employment a lot too. When Google is able to hire a lot more people and absorb a lot of the slack, it's going to be hard.
Yeah, I agree. I think the big companies are going to be an interesting play here. Twitter going full remote, and probably going to continue to pay Silicon Valley level salaries for a while. Again, makes that Hawaii plan or some other cool place,
Montana, Wyoming, anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Like Wyoming, I think I just saw. It's like a handful of deaths in this thing so far, right? There's almost no one that lives in Wyoming, and they've never locked down. Actually, I only live an hour away from there right now, and we've talked about driving up there for dinner because it's probably one of the safer places, even though they haven't locked down. There's just no one. There's not a lot of tourists there either, bringing it in. So outside of probably Jackson Hole. So the
Jackson Hole Airport, by the way, is closed to prior permission. You have to actually call them before you want to go there.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So they're forming their own little green zone there. And so it's interesting. And Twitter, this could be a really big advantage for Twitter and the other startups that really figure out how to embrace it.
Do you remember when Yahoo went remote? Remember that when Marissa Mayer had it, and then she had this huge, they weren't getting anything done. And so she said, okay, canceled, everybody come back into the office.
Yeah. And it's going to be interesting because that's what I was going to say is Twitter, is famously, when they announced that, I saw a lot of ex-employees and maybe current ones tweeting about like, holy shit, this is a big deal because we're not a remote culture. And so just flipping the switch like that is kind of another crazy Jack maneuver. My cynical view was he just wants to use it as an excuse to move to Africa with his new hedge fund investors. But yeah, like this is going to be. There's so many interesting aspects of this thing.
All this stuff goes in cycles. it does the same thing every time. We whipsaw as human nature. We whipsaw to the other side, and then everybody realizes it doesn't work as well, and then it comes back to the middle. It regresses to the mean. There's always going to be a balance. And yes, it's accelerating more towards work from home. Actually, just work from home or work as much as you can, 24 hours a day, wherever you are. Yeah. That trend is definitely accelerating, but it all regresses to the mean. Everybody whipsaws. When you have a bad experience on one side, office bad, home good, then it will be home bad, office good. It'll just go in a cycle. Office space will continue to be around, and you'll probably the average person will perform better in the office than at home.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think especially it's, at a minimum, it's a generational thing. So, and I think we still have a couple generations to work through the workforce before totally remote, digitized lifestyles work well. So maybe the kids. Cool.
Well, for sure, it'll be an interesting 6, 12, 18 months as we continue to go through this, especially like we've spent a lot of time talking about work from home. That is just beginning, and that'll be a challenge for all of us. But there's somewhere in this that there are opportunities. There are opportunities being made every day. So, yeah.
And to get back to venture capital, I think it's the best time ever to start a company. This is the time to start a seed stage company. The opportunity cost is low. All the component costs of the business are low. I still think venture capital is abundant. You can get it done over video. You don't need to be in person with people. There's plenty of dry powder. Absolutely start companies right now. And especially when you don't need to hit your quarterly revenue numbers, but you can be out talking to early customers. I think this is where the money is made. This is where the companies that exited in the last few months, last year, last 2 years were started in 2009. We're started in the worst, blood on the streets.
Yeah. Twitter, great example.
Yep. Yeah. So maybe we'll end it there on that upbeat. Now's the time. The opportunity cost is low, and you're set for big returns in the next 5-10 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks you very much, Stephen.
Thanks for
having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank you.
You guys have a good day.